speech. He did a great job. He's a really smart guy. But it's all about victimology. It's all about the
Thank you very much
victims.
for
I just
showing
think
up.
that's...
My name is Tom Cowan. I'm about to introduce the speakers in a moment. This is a kind of a joint symposium on the horrors of what happened 15 years ago, and some remembrances of September 17th, 1787, which, as we all know, was when the Constitution was signed. Just 2 or 3 comments to put things into context. I kept thinking I wish we had done this symposium closer to September 11th. However, it was 15 years ago tonight, on a Thursday, September 20th, that former President George W. Bush addressed a joint session of Congress. It was the first time we heard that the President was thinking of something called Homeland Security, a new cabinet department to deal with the ravages of what occurred 9 days earlier on September 11th. As some of you may know, 3 days after the attack on the Twin Towers, President Bush was at what we call Ground Zero near the demolished World Trade Center. He had a bullhorn and he said, "I hear what you're saying." And he said, "Soon the folks who knocked down these buildings will also be hearing from us." The U.S. attack on Al-Qaeda, and specifically Osama bin Laden, did not start for nearly 3 weeks later, just so you know that, on Sunday, October 7th. So I just wanted to give you some of the dates as to when things happened, a brief, short 15 years ago. On the dais, let's see, going from appropriately maybe left to right, over there. Well, okay, I mean, just, okay, Dr. Leslie Dykeman, great professor here at NEO.
Thank you.
Thank you. Her specialty, psychology. And one reason we have Leslie on the podium, or unless you want to sit there, is to kind of give us her reflections on her efforts to counsel and to offer succor to those who experienced the tragedy of September 11th. In the middle, we have Dr. Steve Harmon, whose specialty is Africa and the Middle East, professor at Pitt State. One of his specialties is Senegal and Mali, which I think the French bombed 1 or 2 years ago, former French colony. He has a new book out called Terrorism and Insurgency in the Sahara-Sahel Region, Corruption, Contraband, Jihad, and the Mali War, 2012-2013. He has spoken at several international and national events, the UN Workshop in 2008, and the U.S. Department of Defense Conference in 2015. And 4 years ago, he retired at the end of the 2012 semester. Hank Coiner, whose office was next to mine. It says on here, a former attorney. There's no such thing as a former attorney. He's an attorney and former NEO history professor. Also the last person to teach German on the campus, one of his specialties. And he has a book out called A Dead Marshal, A Manless Wedding. Some people can identify with that. And Forgotten Baseball Team, 3 episodes in the history of Miami and Ottawa County, Oklahoma. Thank you very much for showing up.
Thank you.
Let's start on the very human side before we get into philosophy or the Constitution. Your efforts, what was it like to deal with people who had the misfortune of experiencing history nearly 15 years ago?
Thank you. Do you want me to come up there, Tom, or do you want me to stay here? Okay, well, how about, is this mic hot? Do we know? Is this mic hot?
It's on.
It is. Okay, well then I'm just going to sit back down. I grew up in New Jersey and spent a lot of time in New York City. And when the Twin Towers went down on September 11th, as many of you, although you may have been very young, remember, it was a bit of a flashbulb memory, a snapshot in time. And I remember I was getting ready to go to class that morning up here at main campus. And I heard this unbelievable statement from the television in the guest room saying that the World Trade Towers had just been bombed. And I thought, that can't be right. No, that can't be right. So I ran into the guest room just in time to see the second trade tower come down. About 6 months before that had happened, I had signed up to be a counselor with the National Disaster Team. never thinking that I would ever be called. I mean, there are lots of counselors out there in the world, and that, Leslie Dykeman would probably fall way down on the list somewhere. So it was a shock, a horror, and a surprise when on the 16th of September, I got a phone call. And I got the phone call from the American Red Cross, and they said, "Are you Leslie Dykeman?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Do you have a license to practice psychology?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Good, we need you in New York tomorrow." So I packed my backpack and I left for New York, not knowing what I would experience, not knowing what I would see, not knowing what I would hear. My PhD is in trauma psych, but I had no idea what trauma really meant until the moment I landed at LaGuardia Airport. There weren't 3 people in the entire airport. My luggage had been searched. I had been searched. It's the first time that had ever happened. So I went to Ground Zero. I was met with armed guards. This is the United States we're talking about. This isn't Bahrain. This isn't someplace that has armed guards in it normally. And those armed guards took me all over the places I had to go in order to meet with people and to talk to them about losing their loved ones, or actually for having witnessed what they saw that day, September 11th. So as I learned very quickly, I was not going to be allowed actually down at Ground Zero permanently. I had to be up at the Pier 54, which was where survivors were coming in order to talk to somebody like me, to get a meal, to get something to sleep on, to meet other people that had gone through the same kind of thing, to look at the long chicken fence, wire fences that had been put up with people's faces and names on them. And my job was really to just talk and let them listen to somebody that hadn't been there, that could give them a touchstone to reality. And then my other job, obviously, was to listen to their horror stories and to get them to talk about what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had smelt, what they had felt. But secondarily, another job I had to do was escort people, and this is the hard part. This is why I don't talk about 9/11 very often, because here it is many years later and it still bothers me. I had to take people into where they were matching DNA. And they would bring in hairbrushes and toothbrushes, and that's all they had left of their loved ones. And we had to figure out how to match DNA with these little tiny pieces of people that were still left. So I spent 2 weeks at the Pier 54. Those were long days, 18-hour days. We got a couple of hours off to go home and sleep or get something to eat. But most of the time we spent at that pier. We fed 5,000 people a day, 3 meals a day. So even though I was a counselor and I was there as a therapist, I was also feeding people, I was doing DNA studies, I was counseling, I was giving people massages if that's what they needed, although I'm not a licensed massage therapist, so don't anybody come here and ask for a massage. It was just, I think in a trauma situation like that where people are reeling, you give whatever you can. So I stayed there for 2 weeks, and then I came back. NEO was gracious enough to give me the full 2 weeks off so that I could do what I had been asked to do by the government. And I came back, and that was it. I really haven't spoken much about 9/11 since I came back. I did one little short talk for the students about a month or 2 after 9/11, but that was it, because it's hard to talk about. So what I'm here today is to answer your questions the best that I can about what I experienced, what New York experienced, what New Jersey experienced, what the survivors experienced, what their family members experienced. So I think that's what I'm here for today. So thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions, so if they want to ask questions of me, that's fine. Questions, anybody? Or did I just tell you everything you needed to know? Thank you for the applause. I appreciate it. Yes.
The psychological difference in America before 9/11 and post 9/11. What changed in the psychology of the society in the way we view not only terrorism abroad or domestic
Okay, that's a really good question. I think there are other people that can also answer. I'll answer from the psychological side. Did everybody hear that question?
The
Okay.
question was, what are the differences pre and post 9/11 in terms of the psychological effect?
Right. Well, I think what we see now is certainly not the culmination of 9/11, because I think it's going to continue in our society. It is labeling the other. We now have a very definite idea of what the other looks like, or so we think. It has made us more, perhaps, I don't know whether the word is aware, but it has made us more skittish about who we allow into our lives and who we allow into our country. We're much more suspicious and cautious of people that we accept. And I think that's definitely the downside of the psychological aftermath of 9/11. But I also think that there's an upside. And that upside is when people are hurting and in pain and are needful, we as a country apparently are more willing to give than we had been before 9/11. Did that answer your question, Spencer? Okay, thank you.
I just want to point out that there was an attack on the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993.
Yes.
The World Trade
By
Center
the
was
same
bombed.
people. By the same people.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if it was by the Saudis, but
Well, it was by Al-Qaeda.
and I think that gets overlooked by what happened in the first year of this century.
Absolutely.
Let's turn to, what any more questions for
I have a question.
Yes.
This is kind of a historical question, but when I was young, people in general were encouraged not to talk about their traumas. I'm sure you remember that, Leslie. Then we went through a period in the 80s and 90s when it was mandatory to talk about your traumas. People would bully you until you talked about something. What's the situation now? What's the current thinking on that?
The current thinking on that is with trauma, okay, and we're talking about this kind of trauma, that PTSD tends to be lessened by talking about it. We see PTSD in soldiers and in police officers and people who wear uniforms much more commonly than we do in other folk. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in other people. What I'm saying is that the more stoic we are about our trauma, especially in the face of something that's really horrific, the more we see PTSD occur. So I think that as far as private counseling is concerned, we still have the need to, tell me about what's going on in your life. But with this kind of public trauma, it's almost a necessity to talk about it. And it doesn't have to be, oh my God, I saw this. It can just be, I was out walking my dog and this bad thing happened. It doesn't have to be horrific, but we have to be able to talk about it, because by talking about it, we open up almost like a stop valve. And don't let those feelings build up until they have nowhere else to explode but outwards.
That answer your question, kind of? Thanks.
Let's put the focus on Dr. Steve Harmon. I guess all American politicians feel they're experts on the Islamic world, but they're not. Try to get us to understand that Islamic point of view. It seems to be one of your specialties here. And I guess the Middle East and Africa are such massive topics. Just leave it open-ended, or what is it you feel that we ought to know about the Islamic world that we think we know, but we're ignorant?
Am I being asked a question, or am I starting my 10 minutes? Okay, well, why don't I just go ahead with what I've got, and I think it'll address the question you asked. Okay, so I'm talking about the impact of the 9/11 attacks on the Salafi jihadist movement itself, as opposed to the impact of the attacks on the United States. The 9/11 attacks put Sunni Salafi jihadism on the map and made al-Qaeda a household name. The modern Islamist movement grew out of Islamic modernism, which began in the late 19th century. These were Muslim intellectuals, including Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani of Persia and Muhammad Abduh of Egypt. And their Islamic modernism was also called Salafism. So I'll explain that term a little bit as we go along. Islamic modernism started as a reaction to Western encroachment and colonization of Muslim lands from Algeria to India, most of which fell under direct European rule in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Islamic modernism coalesced into Islamic fundamentalism as a political movement in the post-World War I period with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which formed up in 1928. The original goals of the Muslim Brotherhood were use what we can from Western science and technology, but only after it's stripped of corrupt Western values, defend Islamic culture from the corrupting influence of the West, restore Muslim unity through revival of the Caliphate, and purge the hypocrite Muslim leadership. That meant leaders of the Islamic world who claimed to be Muslim but were refusing to implement Islamic law. So the Muslim Brotherhood called these leaders hypocrites. So purge the hypocrite Muslim leadership and redeem and reunify the Ummah. The Ummah is the worldwide Muslim community, before turning on the Zionist and Crusader enemies. Now this is Muslim Brotherhood terminology.
You might tell them that we're the Crusaders.
Yes, the Zionists is Israel, and the Jews, more broadly speaking, and the Crusaders is the West, the United States. Well, more Britain at this time. This is early 20th century. Now, Islamic fundamentalism espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood nonetheless was eclipsed by an alternate movement in the Middle East called secular nationalism. And secular nationalism was also pioneered by Egypt, and it came to the fore in the period after World War II. Secular nationalism featured the single-party state under charismatic military leadership, such as Nasser of Egypt, who seized power in Egypt in 1952. It included socialist macroeconomic policy, including state enterprises and state monopolies, but overlaying a large entrepreneurial small business sector. It also included state control of the press and the media, and lip service to Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism as formal colonial power receded in the post-World War II period. Now, after the disastrous June 1967 war against Israel, in which 5 Arab nations were defeated and humiliated by Israel, secular nationalism was widely discredited as a solution to the problems of the Arab and broader Islamic world. The Islamic fundamentalists, increasingly known as Islamists, came to the fore, offering their program as an alternative to failed secular nationalism, the perceived failure of secular nationalism. Features of Islamism include Islam as a political ideology rather than as a religion or a theology. And this is a quote from Gilles Capel. It challenges and undermines the secular order of the body politic and aims to replace it by a divine order. So political Islam or Islamism seeks to replace the concept of popular sovereignty, which they regard as a corrupt Western idea, with divine sovereignty, which they call al-Hakimiyya. That means the sovereignty of God. However, most Islamist organizations have by now accepted some form of popular sovereignty, that is, the electoral process. Now, Islamists make a dichotomy between the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy is the hypocrite Muslim regimes who claim to be Muslim but do not enforce Islamic law. These would include the Nasser regime in Egypt and its successors, among others, And of course, Saddam Hussein's regime in Islam was a secular nationalist regime, which the Islamists would have called and did call hypocritical. That's the near enemy. The far enemy is the U.S. and its Western allies, along with its Middle Eastern client, Israel. The U.S. is seen as the patron and supporter of the secular nationalist Arab regimes. The Soviets supported some of them, but that was the same thing as far as the Islamists were concerned. Communism, capitalism, democracy, all the same corrupt Western nonsense. This debate between do we go after the near enemy first or do we go after the far enemy first, that mirrored a similar debate that raged in the 20th century among communists who debated among themselves, should we establish communism in one country first, like, say, Russia or China, or should we go straight for world communism? And that was a serious debate among communists and socialists. Now, that's all forgotten these days. But the debate between do we go after the near enemy first or the far enemy first, it reminds me a little bit about that political debate among communists. Focus on the near enemy first, which is what most Islamist jihadist groups do, explains why most of the victims of the Salafi jihad have been Muslims. We hear about victims in France, America, but most of the victims of this war are other Muslims. And most Muslims do not support Islamist and certainly not Salafi jihadist groups. These represent a small minority of the world's Muslims. Now, another thing you have to bear in mind is there's a fissure between Shia Islamism and Sunni Islamism, as there's a broader fissure between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. Shia Islamism came to the fore with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and that took the lead in Islamist circles after 1979, leaving Sunni Islamism in the background. Within Shia Islamism, as well as within Sunni Islamism, the near enemy was prioritized over the far enemy. All right, now, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon signaled the beginning of the global Salafi jihad. It brought Sunni Islamism to the forefront, marginalizing Shia Islamism. Up until 9/11, the U.S. had focused its attention on Shia Islamist terrorism. The Iranians, as students, had seized the U.S. embassy staff in Tehran and held them hostage for over a year. That was a huge humiliation for America. 3 years later, in Lebanon, Hezbollah truck bombed the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 250 Marines in one explosion. That was another humiliation for the Americans. And so the Americans focused, understandably perhaps, on Shia Islamist terrorism, and caused the U.S. to overlook the development of Sunni Islamist terrorism, which ultimately has proved to be the real threat to the U.S. and its allies, not Shia terrorism. Now, the 9/11 attacks prioritized for all to see the far enemy and minimized the appeal of the near enemy first strategy. Other Sunni terrorist organizations had focused on the near enemy, such as Algeria's Groupe Islamique Armée in the 1990s and Egypt's Tanzim al-Jihad, which was led in the 1990s by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Who knows who Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri is?
Number 2 at Al-Qaeda.
Well, number 1 now, since, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, He used to lead Tanzim al-Jihad, which focused on the near enemy, namely the Egyptian government. Now, Al-Qaeda took the battle to the far enemy, that is the U.S. homeland. So that's what's different about Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda movement blended the anti-Western ideology of Egyptian Salafism with Saudi Wahhabism, a traditional fundamentalist, uncompromising Muslim creed, to create a new toxic brew called global Salafi jihadism. Osama bin Laden may have been influenced to go after the far enemy by the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi during Gulf War I in the 1990s. His first clear indication that he wanted to go after the far enemy was the 1996 fatwa that he issued, in which he declared jihad against the United States. That was called Declaration of Jihad against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, namely Saudi. Al-Qaeda soon followed up on the 1996 Fetwa with the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Now, the 9/11 attacks, which came 3 years later, made Al-Qaeda the premier Islamist organization, putting Salafi jihadism on the front burner. It touched off the global war on terror. It led to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. It was used to justify the Patriot Act, extraordinary renditions, and black sites. Al-Qaeda and other Sunni Islamist terrorist groups became America's enemy number one, replacing Shia Iran. Now, Sunni Islamist terrorist movements have raised the sectarian stakes in the Muslim world by condemning all Shias as apostates. And apostasy in Islamic law is punishable by death. So you call somebody an apostate, that's hard to walk back, all right? The Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq, led by Abu Musab az-Zarqawi, died in 2006, targeted Shias and their foreign patron, Shia Iran. So he actively targeted Shias, trying to kill as many of them as he could. Pakistani Sunni terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba target Shias in southern Pakistan regularly. Now, ISIS came to the fore in recent years, eclipsing Al-Qaeda. ISIS has doubled down on the sectarian conflict by targeting Shias and other heretical groups. ISIS targets Shias in Iraq and Syria, including Bashar al-Assad's Alawite government in Syria. That's a Shia offshoot. And ISIS has marked all Shias, some 100 million people, for death or slavery. That's their official policy.
Got to think big.
ISIS also targets Yazidis in Iraq, whom they consider heretical. Now, ISIS has also restored the emphasis on the near enemy. ISIS focuses on fighting hypocrite regimes in Iraq and Syria, attempting to replace them with their caliphate. ISIS is offering Sunnis an alternative to the Shia-dominated governments in Iraq and Syria. At the same time, it promises to be a fierce defender of the Sunni Arabs against Shia Iran. ISIS uses its apparent surge of success to attract alienated Sunni youth in the West and other parts of the world who are struggling with their sense of identity. ISIS differs fundamentally from Al-Qaeda in that it nourishes a social constituency rooted in a pan-Sunni identity, and this constituency provides them with a ready supply of recruits. ISIS promises salvation as well as the redemption of Sunni Islam and the restoration of a legitimate caliphate. However, ISIS's recent setbacks in Iraq and Syria have led them to target our European allies, especially France, as well as the United States itself, if you count the San Bernardino shootings, which were marginally linked to ISIS. This belated emphasis on the far enemy as opposed to the near enemy is meant to bolster their flagging recruitment efforts. Okay, that's the end of my prepared talks, so we'll go to our next speaker or go to questions, whatever.
Yeah, I would assume for any half-sane person hearing half of this, how does one ever develop a coherent American policy in that part of the world? I mean, the challenge there, that's a challenge for everybody. I mean,
Well, it helps if you know a little bit about what's going on, which
that is the problem.
there was an article that appeared in the Washington Post in 2006, which got my attention. This is, 5 years after 9/11. And this guy was interviewing people in the Beltway about the war on terror. He was a journalist. And so he got in the habit of asking everyone he interviewed, the last question of every interview, he said, "Do you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia?" And Now, if the Postmaster General doesn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, or the Director of Housing and Urban Development, that's maybe not that big of a deal. But if the Director of Homeland Security, the Secretary of Homeland Security, or civilian employees in the Pentagon, or people on the Defense Appropriations Committee in Congress, if they don't know the difference between Sunnis and Shias, then you got a problem. And he found out that some people knew, but most people he interviewed, including people that were on these committees, worked for the Pentagon, involved in the war on terror, they didn't know the first thing about the difference between Sunnis and Shias. So it's like if Martians came to Earth during the American Civil War, and they decided they wanted to either help one side or the other, or bring peace, or do something, and their commanders are constantly whispering to their cultural advisors, now is it the North or the South that has the slaves? You know, you can see they're not going to accomplish anything with that level of misunderstanding. And that's the way most Americans were when we went into Iraq. We didn't know the difference between Sunnis and Shias. And now the Iraqi society is in a death struggle between Sunnis and Shias, and we still barely get it.
You know, one hand is over here.
Sorry.
I remember shortly after we finished our invasion of Iraq, reading an article by a New York Times reporter who was on a plane to Iraq with a group of Americans who were going over to run the country. And they were all sitting there reading a history of Iraq, trying to get the basic facts about the country. And I know that, to me...
They've got Iraq for dummies.
Right, Iraq for dummies.
And they're trying to run the place.
And they're trying to run the place, yeah.
By the way, the difference, maybe you want to point this out, between Sunni and Shia depends upon who they think is the rightful heir to Muhammad.
Yes.
That's what the dispute's about.
Goes back to the 7th century. Yes, yes.
Since we all live under the tyranny or the freedom of the clock, Hank Coyner, I think you want to bring kind of a constitutional perspective.
Yeah, why don't you, I'd rather stand at the
He wants to
podium.
guide us.
Yeah.
All right.
Might be set up for a short person. So we've heard a lot about the human cost of 9/11. I think that is very important to hear about. And I think that's what makes Americans great in a way. It's one of the best things about Americans, is that when we're faced with a tragedy like this, we tend to focus on the human cost of it. But what often gets overlooked in that is then why it happened. And why did it happen? It happened to send us a message. Do any of you know what that message is? See, that message didn't get through, did it? Because we focused on the human cost of it, which I think is good. I'm not criticizing us for that. The message was, get out of the Middle East. That's the message that the Sunni Muslims who committed 9/11 were trying to send to us. So we decided we needed to strike back. And in doing that, occasionally we run up against the Constitution. So what I want to do is talk about what's happened to our rights and our Constitution since 9/11. Now, the first thing I want to say is, what is the natural form of government? If you just leave people out there by themselves, what's going to happen? What kind of government are you going to have? You're going to have a democracy?
Chaos.
You're going to have chaos. And out of the chaos, one strong person will emerge who has more guns or more friends or something. That is a natural form of government.
Patron-client networks.
For us to be ruled by someone called a
That's what's going to wind up with.
emperor or a dictator or whatever. That is that's normal. Our form of government is not normal. Our form of government requires effort to keep it going. If we don't put that effort in, we will fall back into rule by one strong person or his friends. So, the way we talk about our Constitution is we use a phrase, separation of powers, which many of you have heard in civics class and government class and so on. And what that means is no one person can be trusted with all the power. People are inherently sinful, fallen creatures who are corrupt. They seek power over other people. You can't let one person have all the power or make all the decisions. You have to split it up. That is absolutely vital for us to have a civilization. Now, the way we do this is executive, legislative, judicial. And the words that we use about this separation of powers were invented by a Frenchman about 300 years ago named Montesquieu. He was studying the British Constitution, and many of our founders were trying to perfect the British Constitution. They saw the British Constitution and said, that's a good start, but it can be a lot better. We need to separate. So our Constitution makes it very hard for either the executive branch, which is the president and all the executive agencies, the legislature, which is Congress, or the judicial branch, to rule us. They all have to participate. That is the strength of our constitutional system, that everyone has to work with everyone else. The weakness of our constitutional system is what happens if all three branches work together to violate our rights rather than protect our rights. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect our rights. But what if all three branches work together? What do we do then? We're kind of out of luck, aren't we? Because the way our system is set up, there is no other authority that can step in at that point. The states, the individual people are helpless if the federal government unites behind a bad idea. And if you doubt this, you could ask Mr. Korematsu. Some of you may know who Mr. Korematsu was. You probably know. Well, Shonda knows. Mr. Korematsu was an American citizen of Japanese descent. And during World War II, he was ordered at gunpoint to go to a concentration camp in the desert. Congress had the idea, the president carried it out, the Supreme Court approved it. What was left for Mr. Korematsu to do? Absolutely nothing. He was helpless. So that is the weakness of our Constitution. And when you see the three branches cooperating on something, that might be good, but it might also be very, very bad. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is war. War and its effects on the Constitution. War and the pseudo-war. When was the last time the United States declared war? No, Korea was not declared war. It was a police action. 1941. That's a long time ago, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Does that mean no Americans have died in combat since then?
Yes, not.
We've been at peace all that time? That's amazing, isn't it? No. In Korea and in Vietnam, Congress authorized the use of force but did not declare war. War strengthens the executive. And what our Constitution is designed to do is say to Congress, you are in charge of the funding for war, you are in charge of declaring war, starting and stopping wars. The president runs the war once it's started. But what happens if a war is not declared? Well, the president kind of runs things, doesn't he? So we sort of have three levels here. We have a declared war, and then we have a war that is authorized by Congress, but is not actually a declared war, like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. Then, what happens over time is that the president starts to feel a little bit stronger, and pretty soon he starts to take action without even asking Congress at all. For instance, in Libya, where Congress was not even consulted. We just did it. We just attacked. So war strengthens the executive and unbalances the separation of powers. In the United States today, we have over 1 million law enforcement officers. We really need, actually it's close to 1.25 million. Do we really need that many law enforcement officers? Do you guys think we have enough law enforcement officers? Think we have too many? We've got a lot of them. Why is that a concern? Because the police are basically something like the standing army that our founders were with. Our founders said, a society with a standing army, that standing army obeys the king. We don't want that. The army should obey the people. Well, if you have 1 million law enforcement officers, that's pretty close to having the very kind of standing army that we were most concerned about. Because, frankly, the United States Army is not going to overthrow the government. If you're around U.S. Army people or Marines or sailors or airmen, they are not going to overthrow our government. But policemen might. Policemen will do what they're told, in general. They're afraid of losing their pensions more than anything. Policemen will generally carry out laws they don't agree with, won't they? How many of you have ever had an encounter with a policeman where he said, I know this law is really stupid, but I have to enforce it? And that happens all the time. It happens all the time, doesn't it? So that's one aspect of my concern about this. Another one is the secrecy aspects. The federal government maintains 2 lists you might have heard of recently. One is the no-fly list. If you are on this list, you are not allowed to get on an airplane in the United States. The other list is a terror watch list, which is really unclear what the effect of that is because it's so secret. But you do not know you're on this list. There is no due process at all. Some bureaucratic building puts you on it, and presto, your life is ruined. You can't get a bank account, you can't travel, you can't get a driver's license. You know, it's...
But you can buy a gun.
Yes, they don't say that. So what happens with these pseudo wars is that they never come to an end, and all these wartime measures just keep going on and on and on and on. So let's talk about a specific example. I've been talking kind of abstract here. There was a man named Anwar al-Awlaki. Okay, he was a Muslim, as you might guess. He was an American citizen born in this country to a foreign national. He went to college in this country, studied in this country. Most of his schooling was in this country. He spoke English. He became radicalized by reading the writings of Ibn Khattab, who you didn't mention, but I'm sure you're familiar with, the famous Egyptian radical. And he advocated that Muslims who live in the West should strike against the West, should carry out strikes against the countries they live in. Like this. Like us. Mr. Awlaki was never charged with any crime by the federal government or by a state. There were no criminal charges pending whatsoever against him. He was living in Yemen, and he also never specifically, let me back up a second and tell you what the standard is for the government to take criminal action for something you say. The case of Brandenburg versus Ohio says that the federal government cannot criminally punish you for what you say unless it's directed towards and likely to produce an immediate violent threat. So saying Muslims strike against the West, that's pretty vague, isn't it? Pick up a gun and shoot your buddies at Fort Hood is a little more specific. You know, that would be covered. So Awlaki never said anything like that. But we sent a drone over and killed him while he was riding in a car with some of his friends. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a bomb. He never committed an act of violence against the United States. His name was put on the death list by the president personally. That is too much power for one man to have. To kill an American citizen with no due process, no trial, and no criminal charge. That is just not right under our Constitution. Awlaki's father somehow found out that he was on the kill list, which is a third list they have, the kill list. Hired a lawyer and went before a court and said to this court, Your Honor, my son is no threat to anyone. Make them prove it before they kill him. And this part is important. The court did not just say, no, there's plenty of evidence, we're going to let them kill him. It said, we're not even going to listen to you. You have no standing to bring that claim. You have no right to present evidence before this court. Get out of here. That's frustrating. And that is dangerously close to giving the president the power to do anything he wants. I might mention that a week later, we killed his son, who was drinking tea at a cafe. His son had never been linked to terrorism in any way. And I don't know why we did it. No one knows why we did it. I personally think it was a victory lap. I think we were just saying to the Awlaki family, mess with us, and this is what happens. All right, so let's move on to privacy then, the other point. The Fourth Amendment says that the government, no government, now applies to the state, can search our person or effects without reasonable cause. It also says that they cannot get a warrant without probable cause. However, the National Security Agency has been collecting the data on every single telephone call made in the United States for years. They were supposed to stop November 1st last year. I don't think they did. They claim they did, but they lied about the fact that they were doing it for 5 years. They went before Congress and under oath said, no, we're not doing that. We're not collecting telephone data. And they were all the time. How are you supposed to deal with that in a separation of powers situation? That is very, very tough to handle. So let's talk about something specific here that might have affected everybody in this room. There's now a Treasury Department regulation requiring you, anytime you engage in a financial transaction, to give your physical address. And that applies to health insurance, bank accounts, car insurance, W-2 form when you go to work, anything. And you notice they ask you for your physical address now? They're not even pretending that's for any reason other than so Homeland Security can come get you. That's the reason for that. And that's an example of the post 9/11 thing. This is a little thing. And you mentioned San Bernardino. You may remember when the federal government had this little hissy fit and stomped their little feet in anger over the fact that they couldn't open up the iPhone that belonged to the shooter. Well, they eventually got into the phone. Have you heard anything more about it? What does that tell you? There was no useful information that was there. They had separate personal phones that they had destroyed. What are the odds there was going to be any useful information on that? They just they don't accept any barrier to their power. One kind of warrant they can issue now under this rule is, and the FBI does this on a regular basis, is they can sneak into your home, plant a bug on your computer that tracks every keystroke you make, every IPS address you go to, and not tell you. So, yeah, absolutely no way of knowing that's going on. So, the fourth part is truth. And I think I've mentioned lies here a couple of times. And I think under our system, the people are the sovereign. The people are supposed to be the boss. When the government lies to us, are we really the boss? So, it's on each one of us to watch out for our lives. Because nobody else is going to do it. In 1900, the Democratic Party platform grew very concerned about the United States becoming an empire and taking colonies like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and so on. They were against that. There had just been a war, the Spanish-American War, and we had taken Puerto Rico and Guam and a bunch of other places. The Democratic Party platform for that year said, a country cannot be half empire and half democracy. I wrote down a quote from it. We warn the American people that imperialism abroad will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home. And what is that? It means that if we treat third world people like Filipinos and Puerto Ricans and Yemenis without any rights, eventually the government is going to do what? Turn and look at us and apply the same principles to us. Now, having said all that, I want to give you the other side really quick. Okay? There's a saying that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. Justice Robert H. Jackson said that in one of his court Supreme Court justices. Recently, a justice on the United States Court of Appeals named Richard Posner. I have to be careful because my brother-in-law is a federal judge. His name is Ponzer.
Oh.
So Richard Posner,
Who's in Chicago.
wrote a book by that time, which basically sets out the other side of everything I just said to you. He says, yeah, no problem. Muslims are a threat. Let's imprison them indefinitely without due process. Let's do all this. He defends all this stuff. And this is an educated federal judge. So the other side is out there, if you want, and what he basically said is it's an emergency, the rules don't apply. So that's for each of you to decide. That's not my place to say. Any questions about it?
You mentioned tonight the comments that Dr. Cohen discussed about the importance of recognizing the difference between on the other side of that, how do you kind of reconcile the identifying a government as a law group and we're asking the law group as opposed to a collection of individuals?
So I think the question he's asking isn't, I'm talking about the government like it's an entity. And of course, it's made up of individuals. So I think the key there is to think through the separation of powers issue. So if the president gets out of control, Congress is supposed to set that take care of that. If they don't do it, the Supreme Court is supposed to set it. Those people need to have a strong sense of duty to the Constitution. And it's hard because, frankly, if you're a member of Congress, what does your paycheck say on it? It says United States of America. If you're a federal judge, what does your paycheck say on it? It says United States of America. That's your employer. That's where your paycheck comes from. So it's asking a lot to ask federal judges to go against Congress. It's not natural for that. They don't mind striking down state laws, but they striking down federal law. So I do think, to answer your question more directly, how do you deal with the individuals? You have to ask them. You have to confront them as a citizen. You have to say, I'm a citizen of the United States. That's wrong. Very few people are really capable of defending a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about. They don't really want to defend it. They just don't want anybody to talk about it. Any other questions?
I'm just wondering, how do you think there ought to be a requirement for a public affairs test for people who run for office? Now, we all know full well, question would be who would administer it, is that legal, and then of course the idea dies. But I think particularly with Steve's comments, most of what was discussed up here, you don't hear discussed in the current campaign. I think it's a frustration for people. You ought to see how difficult it is that a lot of choices are not being presented because of the format of American politics at this time. I'll just leave it at that. That's the whole presentation, not budget or so. Any questions from anybody else? Go ahead.
I'm born in
Where are you from?
Senegal, and I grew up in the Middle East. I wanted to ask, your most famous movies are things like Star Wars, and I can't think of any others right now, but the main theme of these movies is that there is a big foreign oppressor, and oppression breeds the power to overcome this. I'm not saying that, like, the ISIS will never overcome what world movement could be, like, enforced against them. I'm just saying, is that something that you guys would agree to when you see things like ISIS being formed out of the years of, like, with them in Iraq, Sunnis, from the mainly Shia majority, or I'm not sure if my knowledge is correct on this, but there was in jail, which a lot of people, suspected people were kept in, and once the U.S. stepped out, the jail was just, the doors were open, and the freedom there was just much better.
What, Guantanamo or what?
You're talking about Albright.
Oh.
Would you guys agree to that sentiment?
It's more your line.
Would you agree to say that oppression still breeds power? That is the reason.
Unless you get squashed flat.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. Yes, I would agree with you. I'm reading a book right now by Fawaz Gerges called ISIS: A History. And he talks about Camp Bucca, which was an American-run prison in southern Iraq, where among others who were imprisoned there by the Americans during the war in Iraq in the early 2000s was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called Caliph of Islam, the head of the head of ISIS. And Gerges says that they called it the university because that's all the jihadists, they were thrown in there for whatever, whatever, someone turned them in and said, oh, this is a bad guy, and they'd throw them in jail. They'd come out with a degree in Salafi jihadism. What you're mentioning, your mention of Star Wars, there was a post on Facebook just a few weeks ago. I saw the same post several years ago. There's a young woman who was a CIA agent for many years, and she described interrogating a terrorist suspect in Afghanistan. This guy spoke English quite well. He was of Afghan or Pakistani background, but apparently spent a lot of time in England. And he talked about how in these movies you have, like you said, a foreign oppressor clamping down and trying to rule, whether it's Star Wars or whether it's Avatar or whether it's there's a lot of movies fit this pattern. And you got this plucky band of rebels who's trying to free their people from this oppressor. And he said, are you familiar with movies like that? And she said, well, yeah, there's a lot of them. And he said, okay. He said, well, from the point of view of many of us in the Middle East, you're the oppressor, and we're Han Solo, and what was the name of the Luke Skywalker? Yeah.
Chewbacca.
Yeah. So they're the plucky band of rebels trying to defend their people against an evil oppressor. I'm not sure I totally buy that line, but you can kind of see how some people might. That's kind of what you were alluding to, is that not?
I see the microphone.
Oh, yeah, by all means.
I will say that oppression breeds resistance, but it can also sometimes crush resistance. Not everyone is strong enough to fight back. While we're on Star Wars, though, I'll mention, I can't remember which Star Wars it is, but, there is, Star Wars does show the end of the Republic. And they say this is how the Republic ends, to overwhelming applause or something, and the big leader stands up and everyone cheers and goes, yay, he's going to save us. So that is kind of how democracies come to an end. You have chaos and a strong leader emerges. And that's actually, in Star Wars, it's based on the end of the Roman Republic. That's what they were copying, was the development of the Roman Empire. But it is a little scary to have the cult of personality start to build up among leaders.
Well, in Egypt, we had an election in 2013. The Islamic Brotherhood was voted in narrowly. Most of the membership of the Islamic Brotherhood was murdered off in August of 2013 by the Egyptian leader, Mohammed Atsi.
Mohammed Atsi.
The United States, I guess, as you'll point out, has a kind of mixed relationship when it comes to democracy for the Arab nations, for non-Israelis in the Middle East. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood elected government was overthrown in less than a year by the army, and with the most Egyptians applauding the overthrow of the government. Now, I wasn't that fond of the Muslim Brotherhood government, and they were kind of pushing their agenda a little bit stridently. But, you know, they were elected to a 4 or 5 year term. They were overthrown by the military after not even a year. That's all I have on that one.
Well, we've been together for about an hour, and I know part of me wants to just keep here for hours, but I know that's a minority point of view, correct?
They're getting restless, yeah.
Listen, thank you very much. Any questions, just say something, otherwise, thank you for showing up, look forward to seeing your papers.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
My students don't have papers.